Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for looking after me so well. Thank you. I actually haven't been at the V&A for as long as many curators who've been, or other people who've been there for over 30 or 40 years. So I was there for 13 years full-time and then 2 years full-time. So much of this talk draws on my experience as head of equality and diversity at the V&A. I no longer hold that position, but I am still attached to the museum as a researcher into child migration to East London, linked to the V&A Museum of Childhood. More of that later. The V&A is housed in a large, some people think forbidding, Victorian building that is free to enter. The V&A's present mission statement is to be recognized as the world's leading museum of art and performance, to enrich people's lives by promoting research, knowledge, and enjoyment of the designed world to the widest possible audience. When I developed the diversity policy, it had the words diversity and equality in there, so it's interesting of where the widest possible actually means diverse. And we strive to make the V&A matter to more people. The V&A started after the Great Exhibition of 1851, the height of Britain's imperial power. As such, it has collections from across the world, notably Asia. When I first went to the V&A, my job was to develop programs based on the Chinese and Indian galleries, and with a focus on working with British, Chinese, and South Asian audiences. Initially at the V&A, therefore, I worked on such programs as Diwali, the Hindu Festival of Light. Here you see children of Asian origin from West London performing in the Indian gallery on the right. I also worked on the exhibition of the arts of the Sikh kingdoms. The idea for the exhibition came from prominent members of the Sikh community celebrating the 300th anniversary of the Khalsa. V&A staff visited Sikh temples and Sikh festivals to encourage people to visit. We trained volunteers from the Sikh community to give talks about the exhibition to other Sikhs across the country. Sikh organizations organized coach loads from across the country, and young Sikh students set up a help desk to receive visitors. The museum was transformed. Over 60% of almost 120,000 visitors were of Sikh origin. Many had never visited any museum before, never mind the V&A, particularly the coach loads from the Sikh temples. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Some Sikhs, however, were disappointed that the Sikh gurus, the Sikh teachers, were not featured, something that Karen spoke yesterday about this relationship between religion and art. Certain questions arose. How do we sustain relationships with communities after such an exhibition closes? How far should a museum of art incorporate issues of religion? And were the Sikh community only interested in Sikh-related exhibitions and objects, or medieval Renaissance art, etc.? But what about communities where there is no collection? The belief at the time was that the V&A did not collect Africa, a legacy of the colonial period that African art south of the Sahara was considered ethnography, not art. I looked at the visitor figures. That less than 1% of visitors were Black British and/or African Caribbean descent. Oh, sorry, I've gone. Well, okay. I uncovered £1 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund for a project, Capacity Building and Cultural Ownership. Under the Hidden Histories strand, as it related to the South Kensington site, we aimed to establish whether it was true that the V&A had no African collections, explore the link between religious objects in the V&A and people's living cultures and faiths, not just of the Sikh community, but of other faiths. We were also interested in having a social impact, increasing intercultural understanding of social cohesion, policies supported by the Labour government at the time. Research into objects related to the African diaspora was not easy. Often the objects weren't classified as Africa. The object on the left, for example, was found in the furniture department's collection. The interest of a previous curator had been in the furniture in the painting rather than in the person, a poet. But despite these challenges, we uncovered over 4,000 objects related to the African diaspora. No longer could the V&A say that we do not collect Africa. We put on programs, sometimes but not always, related to the objects we were researching. The postcard on the left is advertising our day of record. People of African Caribbean origin came to have their hair and nails photographed, and these were incorporated into the collections. This was alongside a day of related talks and films by academics, journalists, and cultural theorists. The photo on the right is a workshop alongside the exhibition The Supremes. As part of the Black Heritage Programme, we invited African Caribbean and Brazilian Notting Hill Carnival bands to parade within the V&A. It was a logistic nightmare, but anyway. People of all backgrounds were able to see the costumes at close quarters. If you've been to the Notting Hill, you know you can never see them. And participate in workshops from calypso, costume design, steel pan to samba. There were also targeted workshops for children of supplementary schools. It's like after school. Run by African Caribbean communities, as seen here on the right. The African Diaspora Initiative and related Black Heritage Programme led to a change in the V&A's collecting policy, as the museum now actively collects objects related to the African diaspora. As part of this drive, the V&A partnered with the Black Cultural Archives in South London for the project Staying Power, collecting photography that reflected the Black British experience from 1950 to 2000. 2 exhibitions were held in 2015. One at the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton, South London, where many people of African Caribbean descent have traditionally settled, and one at the V&A in South Kensington, which is a far more, a richer borough. The exhibitions in both venues combined images with oral history. One of the reasons we were able to change, this is a group actually, it was educators and curators came together to really address this issue of the Black presence within the V&A. But one of the reasons we were able to change was that we actually got the support of the head of collections. And I think it's really important to recognize where you are in the power dynamics of the whole institution. And indeed, a previous director committed the V&A to having an African gallery in the public. In fact, I'm not sure where that proposal is, and that's a whole issue of change in staff, change in direction, etc., as to what can happen. To explore the links between religious objects in the V&A and people's living cultures, we set up 8 advisory groups: Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, Hindu, Jain, Islam, and a secular one. We asked group members to select V&A objects most important to them. The object on the left, for example, was chosen by a Tibetan monk in exile, as it reminded him of his youth. Some groups told us that the museum documentation was either wrong or offensive. The Jewish community, for example, told us that the term Wailing Wall was no longer acceptable. Some curators listened to what the group said and changed the documentation. Some of the people were real experts in their field. But other curators were very resistant to listening to external expertise. The Jain community suggested we buy patter paintings, seen on the left. They also suggested we take an object out of the stores and put it on display, as it illustrates an important pilgrimage place in India. The V&A responded to both these suggestions, and we increased the Jain audience. The reopening of the Middle Eastern Islamic Art Gallery was seen as a vehicle to bring in new Islamic audiences, contribute to intercultural understanding, and rather naively now, counter a growing Islamophobia. These were laudable, naive, but ambitious claims. We ran 3 weekends around 3 Middle Eastern cultures: Turkish, Persian, and Arab. The bottom image is a fashion show of historic Arab costumes. We also ran a series of winter festivals: Diwali, Christmas, Eid, and Hanukkah, advertised together in order to encourage people to come to each celebrations. We ran smaller programs, training people from different faith communities to give gallery tours. One group of Muslim imams and Christian priests came from right the north of England on a day tour. Our visit to London has as its primary purpose the development of good relationships in the faith leadership of the borough of Burnley, while learning about our own and each other's communities. The museum, seeing itself as a secular space, can sometimes feel uncomfortable with this explicit religious purpose, but people do not leave their spiritual beliefs or cultural traditions at the door of the museum. The V&A, however, runs more secular Islam art-related programs, such as the biannual international contemporary art competition inspired by the Islamic collections. It has also run an exhibition of contemporary Middle Eastern photography and a seminar on how to use the Islamic art collections. Other intercultural programs include tours for speakers of English as a second language. For Refugee Week, the V&A trained refugees to give tours, sharing their life stories through objects. Marie Lees told of her experience of fleeing Rwanda during the genocide. As she explained, for years I took part in different activities aimed at supporting the integration of refugees, but nothing matched the experience of the V&A, in particular my V&A project. Small, but, you know. Freya from Iraq was another my V&A guide. I can't forget the tears and emotions of the people who accompanied me through my tour and their empathy. I think there are questions of where empathy goes, what you do with that empathy. The concluding remarks of the evaluation of the capacity building and cultural ownership project were that it was remarkable how much had been achieved in 3 years for such a complex project with so many outputs, working in a sophisticated international institution with other priorities demanding management time. But it does point to consideration being given to integrating diversity into policy priorities. It recommended the adoption of a whole museum approach where diversity should be integrated into policy priorities. We had not been idle on this front. In 2003, under a Labour government, I had developed an access, inclusion and diversity policy overseen by a steering group with representatives from every department across the museum. As you can see from this updated equality and diversity policy of 2014, the commitment is still there to integrate equality and diversity into everything the museum does, on paper at least. The staff profile, the collections, audiences, programs and events. And it links clearly to the Equality Act 2010, which is pan like the different diversities. The previous access, inclusion, diversity policy went into more detail. It stated that the collections should reflect the diversity of people's heritage, include work by diverse practitioners, and stated curators should, where appropriate, engage and consult people when making acquisitions. That's something that curators or people only happens occasionally, I would say. I found conservators, among you, very open to consultation with communities over objects, particularly of sacred significance. I think there's some really excellent work within the conservation profession. We found temporary exhibitions, depending on the content, to be a very successful way of bringing in new audiences. Here you see a comparative study in relation to the ethnic profile of visitors to temporary exhibitions. Data is always collected on temporary exhibitions, but also in relation to class, age, gender. It's important to understand your audience profile and to set and monitor targets for the museum as a whole. Under the Labour government, we were given targets and we had to set our own. It's far less strict now. The V&A, it's an issue of what you think motivates change. The V&A, for example, increased its ethnic diversity from 11% in 2007-8 to 16% in 2015, slightly above the national average. However, such figures are less impressive when you take account of the London factor, where over 40% are of Black, Asian, and ethnic minority background. These figures, however, are more encouraging than those related to socio-economic background. The V&A continues to attract only 10 to 11% of what we call class, social economic class 5 to 8, a figure far below the national average. Although the V&A Museum of Childhood in East London is a lot stronger. Free admission is not the only solution. Oh, sorry. This is Barry Ginley, who has now taken on the strategic role on equality and diversity since I left. On the right is Janet Brown, who runs the Black Heritage Programme. A museum is far more able to transform itself if it has a diverse staff at all levels of the organisation and a culture that allows people from diverse backgrounds to succeed. Whilst it's important that everybody takes on responsibility for equality and diversity, this should not replace having staff with specific skills and responsibility for diversity working at a senior and strategic level. I think there was a debate. I was so successful in saying we should embed diversity that they said, okay, it's everybody's responsibility, therefore that's okay, we can get rid of those people with expertise. Danger. I recently went back to talk to Janet and Barry about equality and diversity at the V&A. I no longer have that role. I would say there's less an emphasis on strategic planning. It's an issue of, how far you change a museum with strategic planning, I think. But there are examples of good practice and legacies from the capacity building and cultural ownership project. Janet, for example, was keen to tell me about the refurbishment of the European galleries 1600 to 1800. When the galleries were being redesigned, I helped devise a very simple form that required curators to fill in what objects they were choosing related to different aspects of diversity: ethnicity, religion, gender, socioeconomic class, sexuality, disability. Diversity, therefore, was not an afterthought, but a key factor in the planning of the gallery from the outset. Janet showed me 17 objects that relate to the African diaspora within the galleries. The bust of a boy was one of the 5,000 identified through research into African objects. Another was this print of Toussaint Louverture, for example, a high-ranking officer who led the rebellion against slavery in Haiti. There are also objects of religious significance. This Torah used to be in a dark corridor. Highlighting the object illustrates the fact that the Dutch Republic was one of the few places in Europe at the time where Jews could live and work without restrictions, severe restrictions. The V&A, like many national museums of art, find it difficult to attract low socioeconomic groups. One strategy needs more exploration, but is to focus on the skill of the craftsman to making these elite objects. It is in this interactive, the work of coach making and saddlery is highlighted, as well as the beauty of the finished object. I remember going, when I first went there, with somebody who I grew up with, who was a plumber, a craftsman, and we went to see the Grinling Gibbons exhibition, which was wood. And it was very interesting how he responded to the craft element. Building on the experience of the intercultural guides, Janet Brown has trained 15 people of Black, British, African, Caribbean origin to give tours of the galleries, a very different profile from other tour guides at the V&A. She also runs a year-round public program with input from people of different cultural backgrounds and targeted appropriately. One aspect of the world of the project, the capacity building and cultural ownership project, was the World in the East End Gallery at the V&A Museum of Childhood, that I and a colleague developed in partnership with local communities to reflect the diversity of the area. We trained people to collect from the community. Inspired by this project, I am presently researching child migration to East London from 1930 to the present day. This is part of a collaborative PhD between Queen Mary, University of London, and V&A Museum of Childhood. I've interviewed 36 people, the youngest 5, the oldest 99. Their stories, drawings, photographs, and music have been integrated into a website and 4 films co-produced with former child migrants that are available on the website, on YouTube, and being screened in schools, universities, community, and art venues and cinemas. As part of my PhD, I've also been researching how migration is approached in museums and public spaces worldwide. There is some fascinating work, but there is a dearth of research into reflection, assessment, and impact. Organizations such as the Museums Association claim that museums change lives, but we need to look at where the evidence is. How do we capture it, and whose lives are we changing? Having traveled the world in search of good practice, and there is some, But I was also heartened to find in my backyard in Hackney Museum. This museum has an impressive record of working with diverse communities. They took the stories from the website, my research, and the films, and developed a program for local schools. The evaluator of the program used personal meaning mapping to explore what children knew about child migrations before and after the session. This showed that children gained an understanding of the refugee as a brave and resilient person, as opposed to helplessness with which refugees are often associated, or worse, and generated feelings of unfairness that can set the ground for a deeper realization of the injustice that takes place. It's just a little snapshot, but it points to the need that we need to be evaluating what we're doing. Evaluations at film screenings showed that people made the connections between historical migration and what is happening today. Shows us a terrible reality of human survival. With the current situation, it opened my eyes. Okay, last slide. So what have I learned from these experiences? I've learned that equality and diversity need to be considered at the beginning of any new policy or program, whether it be in relation to audience development, staff development, volunteering, collecting policy, education, or exhibition program. It needs to be part of our DNA. It's important to set and monitor objectives, not just in terms of numbers, but to measure impacts, such as understanding, challenging prejudice, contributing to cohesion, encouraging learning or creativity. How can we maintain we can do any of these things if we don't provide evidence? Leadership is crucial. We could not have changed the collecting policy with respect to the African diaspora if the director of collections had not listened and responded. There are clear advantages in consulting and building effective partnerships, but the museum's not good always at collaborating, and indeed in renouncing power. But museums need to do this if they are to bring those who work at the margins, both internally and externally, into the core of the museum. Lastly, we need to take risks, explore difficult and challenging subjects that are of relevance, whether it's the rise of Islamophobia, poverty, human rights abuse, migration, or indeed the era we are in. Okay.
In Vienna. I'm very impressed, thank you very much, I'm very impressed of your own work and what the Vna did in terms of diversity, and yeah, it's really great. I have a very specific question. Did you ever, during your time at the museum, did you ever celebrate in the museum kind of religious festivity like Easter or Christmas? Yeah. I mean, did you ever celebrate a Catholic or religious fest in the museum? Because there is a strong, I think we have very often we have a strong association of ethnic minorities and religions, and so we invite them for celebrating religious ceremonies in the museum, which we are not really used to do with our own European dominant religions.
Yeah, it's been really, I think it's really interesting area, religion. Is this working? Yes. Okay. Yes, that series of 4 festivals, it was quite a simple thing, but it was interesting because we marketed them together, which was Christmas, Diwali, Eid, and Diwali. And actually, people did come to it.
You can't work with your hands and talk, so you need to be, or I'll just hold it and you can, because otherwise it won't work.
Okay. We did, the issue of religion was difficult. I mean, I think there are within the museum, we always celebrated Christmas, right? But that was never seen as religious. So it's an issue of, well, what is religious and what isn't? So we did do festivals, but we were quite careful, or other people were probably more careful, to ensure that it wasn't too religious, if you like, and so it was more cultural. So we didn't have services or anything, but it's a very difficult line, that. But we did have Diwali and Eid and I think it's very interesting, and Hanukkah, and Christmas. And we did it as a series, and people came to each other's, and we collaborated with external partners. And I think it's very interesting that Diwali was more mixed, because we did the profile of who was coming to each. Eid was less so, but it brought in a huge pan-Muslim community, Eid, actually. So, yeah.
Another question. Yeah, the microphone is coming. Do you want to...
Did that answer the question?
Edward, do you want to sit down?
Okay.
Can I...
Hi, Edwirsch, the German Museums Association. And I wonder, you were quoting a lot of statistics. And how do you register the people as Jewish or Catholic and from Russia or from Cameroon? They are buying the ticket, and at the same time they have to make remarks,
Okay.
no?
We have what's called, I think it used to be called Moripol, it's called somebody else. The museum has, well, I can't tell you now, but it had all the years I was there. Every 3 months they had what they call a visitor profile. So it was, a research data organization. And so they used to, 3 months, they used to collect in relation to gender, age, ethnicity. I know this is less common in many countries across Europe, which
in
is
Germany,
interesting.
it's a really sensible theme.
So, I mean, it's also in our census data as well. We do it, in our census data every 10 years. So we do it every 3 months, but we also did it on specific exhibitions. And we often did it with self-completion. So we used to have an event, and we used to have a very simple self-completion and collected data there. So we had this regular 3-month walk-in visitors, but then we did it on specific exhibitions and events.
Okay, thank you.
Last question.
I have 2 questions concerning the marketing. Katharina Bechler, Städtische Museen Hanau. I have 2 questions concerning the marketing and how you get in contact to the communities. I come from a city with 100,000 inhabitants, with 140 communities of our people of the world. And our museums, we would like to get in contact, but once we made a Turkish exhibition, but Turkish people didn't come. So we have really the problem of marketing, of contact, or do you work together, for example, with churches or religious associations? This was also the first questions. Do you make festivals, or where is the friendship between culture of a community and religious festivals?
I think it depends. You can work with diverse communities in different ways. With a big exhibition like the Sikh Exhibition, it was very much a partnership. We worked with Sikh leaders. They proposed the exhibition. And we worked with them. And I think there's a whole thing about exchange, the way you work with people, so that you recognize the expertise within the communities and you bring them. And if your staffing is more diverse, that helps as well. I think it's about building partnerships from the beginning, and whether that's with a specific, if you see somebody like Janet who works, she's well networked with the black community. I went into the museum sector. Actually, I've been working with communities until I was 50. So I brought in a whole lot of communities. So I think it depends on your staffing. Not only whether they have the experience and networks, but whether they have the skills to work with communities, but to start working more equitably with people. So you're not just sending people stuff that you've thought of in your ivory tower and saying, come, but it's a different relationship.
Whoa. Last question, and that's only because she's Dutch.
Thank you very much. Danielle Kuijten from Imagine IC in Amsterdam. I was just wondering, thank you very much for your presentation. first of all. I was wondering, you've been talking about all these different communities you've been getting in and trying to get them represented as well. But I was also wondering about creating empathy between the different communities. Did you also organize programs to get them talking to each other, so to create empathy crossing the communities and not only between the museum professionals and those different segregated communities?
Yeah, I think I think you can do it in different ways. It's a big these are all big questions. You can do it. I mean, I think the World in the East End project that I did, that I couldn't go into because there's too much to talk about, but at the Museum of Childhood, we trained people from 9 different communities. So we had the Bangladeshi and the White East End and the Somali and the Turkish and the Caribbean. And they worked as a group, and they went out collecting material from those different communities. So it was a more cross-themed rather than specific communities. And certainly in the public programs, there is, you know, even you're doing something on Black heritage, you will have a mixed audience, you know. But, and the festivals were joint. But it is an issue, I think, that we need to do more. But it's how controlled you are with that as well. I don't know if this is, it's about fluidity as well. You can't put people into boxes, it seems to me. Okay.
And boxing the people. Thank you so much, Eithne. And I noticed a paradigm shift in the narrative of our conference. You are starting to ask questions between or after the talks. Very nice.